Before the next episode of X Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. Welcome to part 3 of the Tony Long story on X Job Downloaded. My name is Paul Maleary, and for 30 years I served with Essex Police. During this time I interviewed suspects for murder, abduction, rape and extortion, plus a variety of other crimes. Now I interview former police and military personnel and anybody else who has an interesting story to tell. Sit back and listen to X Job Downloaded. Things happen to
but
me.
I think if you going back to I think you're absolutely right. You know, the silent majority, they call the silent majority for a very good reason. That's because they don't say an awful lot. Of late we're starting to, they're starting to sort of come out of their shell a little bit because they've probably had enough.
Yeah.
But the vociferous minority is always listened to, and something else I never really realised when growing up, or even when I was in the police, I probably started to notice it towards the end a little bit. I've noticed it much more when you take a pace back from an organisation and you look at it, slightly differently. And talking to people, particularly journalists and people like that, people within the media, you don't realise, I don't think, just how liberal this country is.
Mm.
We have this sort of proud to you and me, not so proud to liberals, but as a small country, we own 3/4 of the world. We had the biggest empire. We were powerful. We all know that we're not anymore. We all get that, but there is, only this country is having pride in your national flag seen as a sign of being, an extreme right.
Right,
we are so liberal that even having a hat with a Union Jack on it makes you extreme right wing. I mean, I can't think of any other country in the world.
I know.
There was a bit of footage the other day of some pro Gaza demonstrators in London, and they were standing, about 5 or 6 of them. They're all standing wearing like little yellow tabards across the front of this building. It's got big double doors. It's obviously up the West End, and you can just make out 2 security guards standing behind it, like blocking their entrance. And I don't know what the building was. I don't know what the relevance of their protest was at that particular location. But you see the police actually come in, having said, right, come on, you need to move on. And then they physically get between the demonstrators and the security guards and start pushing them away. And the title of it was, police brutality. And I think I shouldn't do it, but, it's 9 o'clock at night and I'm on the couch and I'm like, ugh. And I went, police brutality, question mark. I went, have a look how every police force in Europe, even some of the most liberal countries like Holland or Sweden, you can have a word with yourself. Brutality, just pushing some people out the way of a door. But it's almost pathetic. It's like what is seen as a sort of extreme right wing stuff just isn't. It's almost like we want.
But I want to see positive policing. I want criminals to feel in fear of their liberty being taken every time they go out and commit a crime. I don't want them to think that we're a soft touch. And that doesn't make me, I've got friends who we sit across both sides of, I think I sit in the middle when it comes to politics, and I've got friends who are the other way and I've got friends who are the other. So, but what is lovely about this country is that with bright people, you can have a balanced conversation.
Well, you used to be able to, and I think social media's taking that away.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Because people, you can't have a conversation. What you can do is you can say blah, 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 and then someone else says blah, blah, blah. And you very rarely see anybody come to terms and go, oh, fair one, I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah.
they just stick to their guns, and it just becomes a ridiculous pissing competition that no one's going to win. And it's just made. I just think it's become really divisive.
Yeah. Oh, social media is awful. And then of course you move forward into the 2000s, and you have the most significant contact of your career. I mean, what was that day like? I don't want you to go into the full details because, as I say, it's contained within your book, and I'd like people to get your book. But you went through absolute hell.
What, this book?
That book, Lethal Force. That book, mate. Put it up on the screen. Put it up on the screen.
I was going to do it at the end, but yeah, there you go. Lethal Force.
So the fact is that you went through an horrendous time, having been told that you'd done nothing wrong. How did that all work out? So,
just so you understand the sequence of events, I shot Zell Rodney on day 2 of a armed operation, intelligence-led armed operation, where we, when I say we, the police, not the door kickers like me, but the techos, were clearly getting evidence or information and intelligence from a source that was very, very close to the team of robbers that we were interested, and was so accurate that it could probably, and obviously you can't say this, but because of the Regulation of Investigative Powers Act, but it was probably coming from some technical source.
Yes.
And so when I found myself having to shoot Zell Rodney, it was based, let's say 50-50, on the intelligence that we'd been given and that we'd been fed over 2 days about what their intentions were, and what type of weaponry they'd have, and what their target was, and what they were going to do to their target, and body language and instinct. So when we got given, we go through various phases. You don't need to know them all, but state red basically means that we've been given clearance by the Silver Commander, the senior detective on the ground running the operation, to do an interdiction and arrest the suspects.
Yeah.
So when we got to that stage, quite quickly after we went to state red, it became apparent to me, and probably most of the convoy of 4 armed vehicles and the control ship, that we were burnt, that the suspects in the car knew we were there. The rear seat passenger, Zell Rodney, was looking around. He was clearly having a heated conversation at one point with the driver and the front seat passenger by leaning forward and sort of shouting into their ears. When the hit went in, I was in the side blocking vehicle. So as soon as the lead vehicle, the Alpha car, did its overtake, for about 10 seconds, I had an unobstructed view of Zell Rodney in the back of that vehicle. And his behaviour led me to believe that we were compromised. And then in the final moments of the interdiction, as we're sort of finalising our vehicle positions, he ducked down on the back seat and sprung back up again.
Right.
But I couldn't see his hands. So, I've said this before, if you shoot a man that's using a little 4-year-old girl as a hostage and stabbing her in the neck, that isn't a difficult decision to make. When you're confronted by 3 guys in balaclavas, heavily armed, and they're all turning towards you at once, that's not a difficult decision to make. But when all you've got to go on is intelligence, and you've done enough jobs, to know that intelligence isn't always accurate, and body language, that is a big leap of faith. And I took that leap, and I shot Zell Rodney, and a gun was found under his body. It wasn't the type of gun we were expecting. It wasn't a MAC-10 submachine gun. It was a 45 auto pistol that had been deactivated, it turns out. But they had 2 other guns in the vehicle. They had handcuffs, they had gloves, they had balaclavas. And they were clearly en route to do what we'd been told they were going to do, which was to rob and then kill these Colombian drug dealers.
Right.
So I was investigated for about 6 months by the IPCC, which is the forerunner of what we now call the IOPC. And they decided within 6 months, which if you look at modern times is amazing, that I had acted lawfully and in conjunction with my training, and that I'd fired no more shots than were necessary in the circumstances. And I'd fired 8 shots at close range, very close range. That I'd acted in accordance with my training, and I'd done nothing wrong. They did, however, submit their report to the CPS for them to have an oversight of it. They gave it to a silk, so one of the most experienced, highly paid barristers in the country, criminal barristers in the country, to look at, and he also decided that there was no question of any criminal proceedings. And so I was restored to operational duties 6 months after the incident, and a year after the incident, I was told that I wasn't going to be prosecuted. And so everything seemed to be swimming. The only hints that there might be problems was the fact that the coroner opened the inquest and then closed it, because having seen all of the available evidence, decided that he couldn't put it before a jury. And the reason he couldn't put it before a jury is because, as I said, 50% of my justification in opening fire was based on intelligence that was Ripper-based.
Yeah.
And so the statements were so heavily redacted that a jury wouldn't be able to make sense of them. And when they wrote Ripper, it had never occurred to them that this scenario might take place. So they hadn't included coroners in the list of people that were authorised to see this redacted evidence.
Right.
Had they done that, then he would have been able to look at it and go, right, okay, I can do this. I can tell the jury, without giving anything away, what the intelligence was. But he couldn't do it. And so that left them with a problem. I think it was the Liberal Conservative, coalition party that picked up the problem. Eventually, I think the long and the short of it was that they came out with legislation that allowed a High Court judge, to listen to the redacted evidence and look at the redacted evidence.
Yeah.
And sit on his own, run a public inquiry and sit on his own without a jury. And that was really, that was really where it all went wrong for me.
Right.
Because it came down, instead of 12, you'd like to think reasonably sensible members of the public, from different backgrounds with different experiences, listening to your evidence and listening to all of the evidence and deciding beyond all reasonable doubt your guilt or innocence. It came down to a liberal, elderly, extremely naive High Court judge that had mainly dealt with civil matters throughout his whole of his life. And instead of, being beyond all reasonable doubt, all he had to satisfy himself was that it was, what's the word?
Balance of probability.
On the balance of probability. And so once he'd said that he felt that I'd acted unlawfully on the balance of probability, the CPS did exactly what they did in the most recent trial that we had, this Chris Cabba thing, in my opinion. They just, they just did the Pontius Pilate act, Well, we're the Romans, we're in charge of, Palestine. We're not interested in that. If it's a Jewish problem, let the Jews decide,
Yeah.
If they want to crucify them, we'll crucify them. It's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And
so, how long did it take before you went to trial, though?
So it took just over 10 years, like a month or so over 10 years from the day of the shooting.
And you'd retired by this point.
So I because I've been recruited to work for the security services.
Right.
The Secret Intelligence Service, and which obviously comes under the Foreign Office. And I completed a selection course in the United States with another agency, and they said, as soon as you get the all clear from the Crown Prosecution Service, we started your vetting, but as soon as you get the all clear from the Crown Prosecution Service, that you're not going to get prosecuted, you can come on board. So by that time, I'm a year past my my 30 years, I'm a year past my retirement date. I got the all clear from the Crown Prosecution Service, but when or my bosses wrote a letter to the Foreign Office saying Police Constable Long is now, established as being in the clear, they'd obviously had a rethink, and they decided, quite correctly as it turned out, that I was probably going to be too controversial and it might turn around and bite them in the arse. So they came up with a bit of pathetic excuse and basically said, we're not interested in taking you on anymore. So I got quite excited about, because I was going to be working, in some quite exotic locations around the world, some dangerous ones, but, it was going to be an interesting job where I could utilise my skills. And then that didn't happen. So I stayed on in the Met for another 3 years, basically, waiting for something else to happen. And eventually I got offered a job in private industry, or the commercial side of things, the commercial side of sort of tactical equipment, and, firearms and that sort of stuff. And so I went to work for a UK-based company, doing that for quite a few years. And then it all caught up, really, that after the public inquiry and the judge had decided that I was going to act unlawfully, that I'd acted unlawfully, it became pretty apparent that I was going to get charged. And of course, if you're charged, you're not going to be able to go through the front door of any police headquarters selling bombs and bullets. So, I went on the private security circuit looking after a Russian squillion heiress in Knightsbridge. Right. And I did that for a few years, did that during the trial. So I obviously took time off for that. So I took a massive drop in wages. During the trial, I was actually unemployed. I'd had to put my property, a property that I owned, that I rented out, on the market. So of course, as soon as I did that, my tenants moved out. So now I was paying 2 mortgages. So actually all of that for me personally, because I mentioned early on in right at the beginning that I'm sort of numerically dyslexic, whatever the correct word for that is. So for me was far more stressful than any of it,
Really?
Yeah.
But I mean, we use the term, don't we, gripping the rail. What was that like walking into the court? Old Bailey, was it?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Old Bailey isn't designed for prisoners on bail. All right, it's designed for people that are going to be brought up from the cells.
Yeah.
So the way the courtroom is designed is just that you come up into a big glass bulletproof box from the cells. But of course, I was on bail, and there isn't a lot of space in there for anyone outside of the people that are actually involved in the case. And so they decided to sit the family of Azelle Rodney, his brothers and his mother, in the seats right next to the steps that went up into the box.
Oh, nice.
Which meant that I literally had to sort of step over their feet. I have to be honest, I didn't have any occasion to talk to them. I'd just say, excuse me, and they just moved their feet back, and there was no eye contact or anything, but there was no overt hostility or anything like that. There had been some early attempts when we were talking about the initial appearances at court to get me in and out of court without me being captured by the press on film.
Yeah.
And the job had agreed to do that. And they used the CTSFO teams, basically my old team, to try and get me in and out. And they were onto a loser from the very outset. When you and I joined the job, magistrates' courts and Crown courts were run by the police. We were responsible for the security and for the admin almost of prisoners and all the rest of it. And of course now it's Serco.
Yeah.
And Serco were like, when they had a retired police officer for murder, they were like a dog with 2 dicks. They just wanted to make life as uncomfortable for me as possible. And so I had 2 experiences. The first one was my very first experience where I was actually formally, the charge was read out, and that was at Westminster Magistrates Court. And then Serco completely flouted and turned their back on an agreement that had been made with the magistrate for me to be taken in police vehicles to the Old Bailey to be given bail, and took me in a prison van, kept me in the cells. I was kept in the cells all day. And then even when I was granted bail at the Old Bailey by the judge, as soon as I was out of the box and in the cell passage, I was put back in handcuffs even though I've been granted bail, taken back down and put back in cell for nearly another hour while I was processed. I'm not even sure that's legal, So I had two really bad experiences. And so what happened was I turned around to the job and said, look, apart from anything else, you're compromising the SFO teams. They do covert operations. They can't be captured, trying to smuggle me in and out of court. It's not working. But the press were massively nose was out of joint because they wouldn't initially release my, because I still had anonymity from the public inquiry, and only the Home Office, only the Home Secretary could take that away.
Yep.
So it had to go back to the Home Secretary, and a decision had to be made about naming my address. So when I came back to court the second time, I came back as Anthony Long as opposed to Echo 7.
Yeah.
But an arrangement had been made with the Police Firearms Officers Association, which is a charity, and the Police Federation to basically pay for a room in the tower block at Police Federation headquarters in Surrey for me to reside in, and that would be my place of residence. And the press went absolutely mental. They thought, we wouldn't have the opportunity to do that. We want his home address. And you're going like, and it was the same with the officer in the Chris Cabba case. Why would you want the officer's name, and why would you want his home address?
Yeah.
So I went mental, and I said, well, they're not having my home address. I'll go inside and on remand rather than give my address away, my family's address away. But what eventually happened was, I said, we came up with this agreement. The judge agreed to having the Police Federation headquarters as my home address. I did actually have a flat there that had clothes in and all the rest of it, wash kit. But a group of my colleagues, former colleagues, got around me. One of whom ran a security company, and they set up an operation, and purely with volunteers, got me in and out of the Old Bailey and my family in and out of the Old Bailey every day. I couldn't go covertly, but several of the guys were now black cab drivers.
Yes.
So we put together this operation whereby they would do counter surveillance sweep of my house every morning, pick me up, take me to a rendezvous point where I'd get in a black cab. The black cab would then use all the bus lanes and the back doubles and all the rest of it to get me to the Old Bailey. Before it did that, it would drop my wife off and any of my friends that were with me in the cab at another location where they'd be met by a little team that would basically CP them for the day. And they put people in the court as well and built up a relationship with Serco, actually, and with the court staff. Because when you're the defendant, you're at the bottom of the list of people to be told what's happening. But the family would get given a heads up so that they could be in court in time to be present when the judge walked in. But my family weren't being told.
Right.
So they basically built a network of spies, if you like, within the Old Bailey. The people that were prepared to help us and thought that I was being wrongly done by. And so I had massive support in the end from a whole range of people, for which my family and I are eternally grateful.
I know you are, mate.
It's,
when that jury comes in, I mean, I feel quite emotional. God knows how you must have felt on the day, but when that jury walk in, those 12 good people, and they say not guilty, I mean, how did that feel for you? What was that? I know you've been interviewed a million times, all right? I know you've been interviewed, but I don't suppose there's many coppers that have sat across the table and asked you these questions, because I can feel it in here. And I'm absolutely serious, Tom, because I just think the job's hard enough. But when those 12 good people walk in, I've been the investigator on murders and I've seen it from the other side. What was that like when they said that they're not guilty?
Right, so it's quite interesting. I'd already promised myself that I was going to go non-emotional. Right. And I'd been rehearsing going non-emotional. And throughout my whole life, we haven't touched upon it really, but the reason possibly that I was first through the window at Northolt and I was the first person to shoot, and possibly the reason that I bailed out of the vehicle and found myself confronting the 3 armed robbers, and probably the reason that I took that leap of faith and fired those shots was because mental rehearsal.
Yeah.
Whenever I train, and even when I'm not training, if I'm designing a training course or whatever I'm doing, or when I was serving anyway, I would always be running hypothetical scenarios through my case. So when I fired my first shots for real, it wasn't a surprise to me. It wasn't like I've got loads of guys that come up to me because I've been involved in shootings that found themselves involved in shootings themselves, and they've come up to me and they've gone, Tony, goes, so you got 2 minutes to talk? And I went, yeah, of course I have, mate. He said, mate, he said, I pulled a trigger. He said, I couldn't believe it was all happening. And I went, well, you're in the wrong fucking job then. Had you never thought that it might happen? Well, no one does, do they? And I went, well, I have. Because, mental, and it's the same with footballers and sportsmen. They mentally prepare for a situation. When I was preparing for the Old Bailey, I was working for this rich millionairess. And one of the things I had to do was walk her huge Russian black terrier around Knightsbridge. Beautiful dog.
Yeah.
Absolute babe magnet. I just had women come up. Oh, I love it. Unbelievable. Posh chicks, loved it. But literally, I would use that. I'd be away from the monitors and the desk and the security of the building, and I'd take the dog to Hyde Park or whatever. As soon as I walked out the gates and the gates shut behind me, I've got a dog on the lead. I'm walking down, and I would say, I swear by Almighty God, the evidence I give to this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Police Constable Anthony Long, attached to the Force Firearms Unit, Your Honour, or my Lord, Yeah. And I'd say that to myself, knowing full well that as a civilian I wouldn't be doing the last bit, Police Constable so-and-so.
Yeah.
Just doing that sort of put me in a space where I then start throwing questions at me. Ridiculous questions, right from the most obvious questions right to the least obvious questions that a barrister might ask me. And I'd give an answer. And if I wasn't satisfied with that answer, when I got back, I'd get on my laptop and I'd Google, whatever the law was or whatever it was. So when I went, the reality is you can be the most experienced barrister in the country, but you still won't know as much about the police use of firearms and about what it's like to be in a real life situation and the actual human dynamics of being shot at or shooting back than I do. I am my own expert witness, and nothing you can say is going to rattle me. And that was exactly my mindset in court. I was actually disappointed at one point. The prosecution case was concluded and they'd failed to mention, as they should have done, that I had a right to have an honestly held belief that my life was in danger. They hadn't mentioned it at all. And it was a big faux pas on the part of the prosecution. And my barrister just kept his powder dry. And as soon as the prosecution case was over, he asked to address the judge in the absence of the jury and put a case forward. And it was all done overnight, submitted letters. But basically saying that there was no case to answer because they hadn't covered the fact that I was entitled to an honestly held belief.
Yeah.
And he said, you probably won't have to give evidence. He said, if we win this, you won't have to give evidence. That's it. The case will be dismissed. And part of me was like, brilliant. And part of me was like, after all this, I want to get in that witness box.
Yeah.
And I want to throw some fucks into that barrister.
Absolutely.
Not literally, but I want to tell the jury exactly what it's like to be in that situation.
Yeah.
I want them to understand what I was going through. And so when the judge turned that down, and I think he probably turned that down almost as a strategic thing because it would leave the prosecution with no options for an appeal.
Yeah.
When I got told, right, first thing tomorrow then, you're on, I was excited.
Yeah.
I was looking forward to it. So anyway, I told myself that I had plenty of time to prepare myself for the jury's result because they came back 4 or 5 times.
Oh, did they?
Over a 4-day period.
Oh my God.
So they send you out and they send you and you sit in the canteen at the Old Bailey and you're not allowed any family or friends there. So you've literally got the barristers, someone from the Police Federation, a couple of serving officers from SO19 that were looking after me. And you sit there and nobody knows what to say because it's all like, make conversation. So you have a coffee and, and then all of a sudden it's all parties in the case of long court 10, please. And your bottle just goes,
Of course it does.
At the sixpence biscuit barrel. And go out to the toilet, have a nervous pee, tidy your tight shirt, make yourself smart, go down, get upstairs, and you get up into the lobby outside of court 10, and someone comes up, it's just a question. The jury have just got a question. Oh. And you go, oh, for fuck's sake. And then you go down and there's another question, and you go, same process again. And then finally, it's coming up to the end of like the second day of deliberations, or early afternoon, that's right. And we all get called, the jury's, back in, right, so we go up there. And the judge is there, and he goes, the jury isn't there. And the judge goes, yes, he said, I've just had a note from the jury that one of the female members of staff has come out in a nasty rash. And so I've sent her off, and I'm like this, my head is in my hands at this point.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Like, oh my God. So I've sent her off to see matron. If matron says that she can carry on, then we'll carry on. And if not, we'll probably call it a day. So we get sent out again, and we get come back in again. If matron's had a look at it, and apparently the rash is quite nasty. So we're going to call it a day, and we'll all be back in at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Yeah. So we all come back in at 9 o'clock tomorrow. And obviously the canister must have worked overnight because the jury's there and it's complete. And I'm like, for fuck's sake. Anyway, finally what happened, the day before they actually came in with the result, I'm thinking there's got to be, you know when you, even as a copper, even as a DC, if you've been the officer in the case and you're sitting through the whole trial, you're trying to read the jury, aren't you?
Oh, you are, absolutely.
100%. You're trying to look and go, yeah, he looks like he's pretty law-abiding. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah. And
I've been doing exactly the same, obviously, And there was one guy in the audience, in the jury, and it was a proper mixed jury. It was a proper cross-section of London. There was a Muslim lady with a headscarf. There was a black lady. There was a light-skinned black guy. There was several light-skinned black. It was a right old mixture.
Yeah.
And you can't help thinking it. I'm a white police officer. I've shot a young black criminal. It's controversial. I get it. But there was one guy, and he was a light-skinned black guy. But I like the cut of his cloth. He only ever dressed casually, but always like smart. He wasn't scruffy. He had a little rucksack in his back. He had a notebook and he was taking notes. But I noticed that whenever the jury came in, he would always allow all the women on and everyone else in first.
Nice.
And he would sit, and there was a little bit of a gentleman about him,
Yeah.
And I thought, he seems like a decent bloke. But it's getting really frustrating. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm theorising, as you do. And I'm thinking, I reckon it's all down to one guy. Because all the way through the trial, the guy that sat in the front right-hand row, last seat, the guy nearest me, was always asking stupid fucking questions. He was always putting his hand up and waving a piece of paper, and it'd be given to the judge, and the judge going, and when I was giving my evidence, he was like in my line of sight, over the shoulder of my barrister. And my barrister's asking me questions. The whole court, including the judge, is obviously looking at me for a response.
Yeah.
But over the shoulder, I can see this dickhead waving a piece of paper. and it's funny because every time he waves one, you could see the rest of the jury going, oh, fucking hell, shut up. You could just read the body language. So anyway, my barrister's asking me the question, and I'm like doing this to my barrister. I'm going, and he's like, looking puzzled, and I sort of just pointed at him, and he turns round and he sees this guy, the question asker, and he's like, well, I'm sure this bloke was on the spectrum. He was a proper geeky little bloke. He's like, I've got a question like that. And my barrister turned round to me and silently mouthed the words, oh, for fuck's sake. It was so obvious. Anyway, so it's the day before they finally come to their verdict, and I'm just exhausted now by the whole process, all of these questions going in and out, the woman with the rash, the whole 9 yards. And my wife, who wasn't actually my wife at the time, and we weren't even together, we didn't even know each other when I actually fired the shots 10 years previously. Right. She is just, absolute stalwart, but you could see that, it was just getting to the stress.
Yeah.
And they put us up in a hotel for the night, so that whether I was acquitted or found not guilty, or guilty, the press, wouldn't turn up on my doorstep if I found out where I lived and all that sort of stuff. And so normally at the end of every day, we would go for a drink. The cab would pick me up, and then they'd take me to a pub that they'd recce'd, and there would be my wife and my friends and some of the guys that had done security for me for the day, and some of the people that had sat in the public gallery and listened to the evidence and discussed how the day had went, that sort of thing. It was like the biggest reunion in the 11 SO19 history. And but we were just so exhausted. We went, no, we don't want to go for a drink. So both of us get in the back of the black cab, and our cabbie is driving us around a bit of a circuitous route, doing a bit of counter surveillance to make sure no one's picked us up. And we drive past a pub, and it's a lovely sunny afternoon, and the jury have been given a half day because of the woman with the thrush.
With the rash.
So on a bench outside the thing are 4 or 5 members of my jury.
Oh no! And
sitting down with his knees together and his hands on his knees like this, like a little bit of a train spotter with his glasses on, held together with elastoplast, is the geek, the question asker. And the guy that I like to cut off, the guy that was a bit of a gentleman, he's saying, yeah, I'll have a pint like that. And one bloke's going, what do you want, mate? And he's, I'll have a Coke or whatever. And you can see one bloke go off to get the drinks. And then the guy that I like leans into this bloke's ear, and you can see him going, what is your fucking problem? And right then I knew that he was the problem, and that they'd taken him for a drink because they'd had an early recess to debrief him and get him on track. Right?
Yeah.
I knew it. Anyway, final day, we come in, and the jury get called back in. But before that happens, the judge said, the jury still haven't come to a decision. They have, however, come to a majority verdict. But I'm not inclined at this time to allow them to do that. So I'm going to send them out until lunchtime to make a decision, and then they come back. But before we do that, I have to ask them if they've come to a decision. So he formally calls all the jury back in, and they ask the chairman to stand, or the foreman to stand, and guess who it is? It's the bloke I like, with the rucksack.
Right.
He stands up, like, full of confidence, almost sort of military bearing, and the judge says to the general or the usher, or whoever it was, clerk of the court, whoever it says, have you come to a decision upon which you are all agreed? And he said, yes, my lord, we have. And like everybody looked at each other. The judge looked puzzled. The jury members next to him start tugging his trousers and going, no, we haven't, And the judge kind of looks over his glasses and he goes, I think you mean no. And he said, oh, sorry, my lord. Yes, we haven't yet come to an agreement. And at that point, no one else, none of my friends, none of the people that were in court that I got to speak to afterwards, no one else noticed it, but I noticed it, that 4 of the women on the jury all took that opportunity with that laughter to turn and look at me and smile.
Yeah.
And I knew 100% I was not guilty, 100%. And then we all went out again while they made their decision. And I'm drawing cartoons, and I'm joking and I'm laughing, and like people are going, "Fucking hell, Tony,
God help me!
What is? You're not stressed?" And we went back in there, and I'd be lying if I said, I didn't have the pucker factor when I was waiting for those final seconds for the not guilty to come across. But I looked up at my wife. Her hands were in her head was in her hands. My son, is Royal Marine, serving Royal Marine. Yeah. Done tours of Afghanistan. You could see he was fighting back the emotion. And the girl from who I kind of sort of built up a sort of friendship with from Serco, who was my guard in the box and who had to take me out the back and search me and pat me down each time. She was like, her bottom lip was fucking going.
Mate, I get it.
Yeah. It was just, but I didn't. I absolutely didn't. I promised myself I was going non-emotional, and I did. And then we all got rushed off through the back doors and everything else. The judge had finally agreed that I could be snuck out, even though I couldn't be snuck in. Black cab takes us to a pub that we'd recce'd down near Tower Bridge, and I drank like a fish.
So would I.
There was about 150 people, 200 people perhaps in they'd taken over the whole basement in this big pub, and everyone was ming-monged, except for me and my missus. And we walked out. I was stone cold sober, and the next day, believe it or not, so I was acquitted on Friday the 3rd of July. On Saturday the 4th of July was going to be the Police Firearms Officers Association black tie ball in Leicester or somewhere like that. So we'd been given free tickets because obviously I didn't know whether I was going to be there. But we said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to leave the hotel near Tower Bridge. We're going to walk across Tower Bridge back to London Bridge, catch a train out into Kent where we live, and then we'll get ourselves to have a shower and change and all the rest of it, and then we'll drive up to Leicester. Yeah. So the missus made us a cup of coffee. We sat having a cup of coffee, and I'm looking through all of my texts. And it's all like, well, I'm telling you, brilliant news, blah, 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 blah. And my missus goes, I'm going to have a bath, actually. I'm not going to have a shower. I'm going to have a bath. I'm going to have a bit of a soak. So just come up when you're ready, sort of thing. So I'm just sitting there looking through my messages. And I suddenly realised I've got voicemails. And I went, And I looked at the voicemails, and I had a similar amount of voicemails, about 200 voicemails.
Wow.
And I listened to the first one. And as soon as I heard a mate's voice with a bit of emotion in it, I just floodgates open. And I was like shaking with emotion. And I went upstairs and I tried to sneak past the bathroom door, and my missus saw me. And she went, "What's the matter with you?" I just went, "Oh, fucking."
I'm not in prison.
Fully clothed, kneeling down, hugging my missus in the bath, just crying like a school kid.
I'll bet.
And that was it. Within 10 minutes, we were both, and I never thought about it again.
Wow.
And it just amazing experience, really. And I think that's what I kind of draw from it is, I touched upon rehearsing for life, and rehearsing for situations. But you've got to take every experience that you get, whether it's good or whether it's bad, and learn from something, and use that in life generally, really.
And as my 4-year-old granddaughter says, and we're teaching her all the different things, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah,
absolutely, 100%. You've actually taught a 4-year-old child that.
Yeah, and the other one is patience is a virtue, and the old ones are the best ones. She says, "Granddad, you're the best one because you're the oldest."
How about the job's fucked? Have you taught her that?
Yeah, I know. God, I hope she never finds that out, mate. I mean, how do you? I know we've been chatting a while, but how do you feel? The Chris Cabba thing. I read the other week that they're going to take that officer to discipline hearing now, gross misconduct hearing. I mean, there's got to be more than, and we can't hypothesize because I don't know what's happened, but it just seems it begs belief that poor bugger's gone through everything that you've gone through, gets identified, the whole lot, and now he's in a situation where he could lose his job. I suppose TJF, mate. That's what it all boils down.
I mean, I actually had a friend of mine, a journalist, ring me up and say and break that news to me. I got really angry, and I deliberately took a couple of hours and thought about it before I committed anything to in social media or anything like that, or spoke to anybody about it. And it's just, and I calmed down quite a lot, and I just kind of rationalised it. Really, it's just like it's been my belief all along. Not so much in my case, but certainly in other cases that we've had since, that the IOPC, as it now is just a completely flawed organisation. It knows it's flawed. It's supposed to be independent. If you actually read its sort of raison d'etre, its sort of guidelines and everything, it's supposed to, keep the family updated. And it's all about the victim, or the complainant or their family. They owe no then I think they should. I think it should be rewritten so that they have a duty of care to the people that they're investigating as well. And that,
absolutely.
And in that should be time limits on investigations. They should have to justify why if they go beyond certain times, because these aren't complicated investigations.
No,
I've had people on television say to me, "Oh, you got to realise that these are very complicated investigations." Well, they're not.
No,
they're really not. You're a former detective. What's a complicated investigation is when you get a torso with no head, hands, or anything in a bin, and you've got to investigate it.
Exactly.
You've got to find out who did it. That's a complicated investigation. Yeah. When you've got the person that pulled the trigger standing over the body with a gun in their hand, still smoking, and going, "Yeah, it's me. What do you want? Do you want my body-worn camera? Do you want a statement? How many rounds did I fire? I'm not sure, but I can tell you. Let me check." It's not complicated at all, and yet it takes them over a year. It should be like 6 weeks max.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we would get a murder trial to court far quicker. I mean, the courts are dragging things out.
The flying squad had an ongoing operation, and they'd had various successes with it, but there were still members of the gang at large in southwest London, doing armed robberies. And eventually they get two of the main characters that they haven't yet arrested, I think. And the robbery comes off, and my old team, it's only a few years ago now, so long after I retired, put in an arrest, and one of the suspects runs. Long story short, police fire shots. He gets hit in the ankle. Turns out he's armed with bolt croppers or something like that, not a gun, whatever. But it took so long to investigate it. I mean, I think both of them were suspended from full operational duty, so they can't conduct the training that they've been, trained to do. They're literally, the public aren't getting any money out of them. They're not allowed to meet the public. So they're literally, we're paying for two police officers that aren't doing anything. Eventually it gets to court and it's established. They offer no evidence. The Crown Prosecution Service offer no evidence. This is like 5 years later. It transpires that the suspect that was wounded and another suspect were basically convicted within 6 months of being arrested.
Unbelievable.
And are actually out of prison by the time you couldn't make
terrible. It up. Tony, do you ever have any contact from the families of any of these people? Is there any outcry in the press? Do you get any sort of ag, or is everything sort of left as be?
So when I got involved in the 1987 shooting where the two suspects died, there were repercussions for that at the funeral of one of the guys. They were gangsters basically, and a lot of their family were criminals, and they attacked the press. I was actually sent off to the States with my wife and kids for a month's holiday, paid for by the job, paid for by the taxpayer, while they provided extra security for the house and looked at moving me and all sorts of things. So I've lived with security on my home address and on my private vehicles and my wife's private vehicle and everything since 1987.
Right.
Wherever I've moved to, they've put in new security, upgraded the security, cameras, alarms, all the rest of it. I've got an panic alarm button that will bring ARVs here in 10 minutes. So from a personal security point of view, I've always lived with that, but I've never let it bother me.
No.
Nowadays you have to be obviously uber careful because this thing tells everybody where you are if they want to. So you've got to be mindful of all of that sort of stuff. And I am, but I don't let it ruin my life.
No.
I get, and the other thing is because had I been allowed to keep my anonymity for the trial at the Old Bailey, had I been allowed to go in and out of the court without my face ending up all over the news and in the papers, I would never have written this. I would never have written it.
No. And we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about it.
Yeah, because for me, had I been acquitted, I could have just carried on with my life as I had done in the past, anonymously without, any problems, But as soon as as my face was all over the newspapers, and as soon as my name was known, I saw it as an opportunity to correct a load of wrongs.
Yeah.
So a lot of stuff had been written about me. As soon as my name came out, it was linked to the abattoir shooting. It was linked to Northolt. It was linked to Commander Stu Akers calling me the Metone serial killer, which he got in the papers. And I'd had all of this stuff written about me. Even the day after I was acquitted at the Old Bailey, the Daily Express said that the officer known to his colleagues as the Eliminator. I've never even heard the Eliminator before. That was a new one. And that was the day after I was acquitted, the bastards. Do you know what I mean? They just literally make shit up. If you as a detective in the 80s had perjured yourself, they would be all over you like jam on a piece of toast. But they do it all the time. They will literally go, right, that story's not interesting enough. You need to make some shit up. Surely he must have a nickname. Call him the Eliminator. So I've had so much of this stuff and so much shit written about to this day, if you get on the internet, you'll find certain places where they'll still describe give Azelle Rodney as an example of an unarmed black man shot by police. And the people that don't like me and the people that don't like the police will go, but the police officer didn't see a gun, did he? No, but he had one. That doesn't make him unarmed. Do you know what I mean? It's like they describe Chris Cabba as being unarmed. No, he wasn't. He had 1.5 tons of metal.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we all see what happened at Liverpool.
Yeah, exactly. So the book was my opportunity to right those wrongs and tell the story from my side of it. And I was lucky enough for a production company to approach me when I wrote the book, or when I was writing the book, and they timed a Channel 4 documentary to come out at the same time as the book.
Right.
And so obviously, as a result of the fact that I'm now a published author, sounds good, doesn't it? And the fact that I've been done a documentary, I find myself being approached by production companies. I've just done one about the Dome Raid that's on Netflix, or I'll get a phone call and say, would you be prepared to come in and comment on a thing about the Chris Cabba shooting or whatever it might be. And so I can't live in the shadows, and I do get recognised. I got recognised in a pub about 3 weeks ago by some guy who fortunately was the son of a copper. Got bloke in his 40s who goes, you were on Tony Long, weren't you? I went, yeah. But I had another one that was more concerning not that long ago, where I went in a pub with a friend. And as I'm walking in through the door, two guys similar age to me, similar haircut to me, could be a copper, could be a villain, sort of nodded at me. And I went, he must know me. So I kind of nodded back and then got a drink, sat at a table near the bar, and the two blokes come back in again. And the bloke stands at the bar and looks at me and he goes, Anthony Long, right? Well, I should have realised then, my radar wasn't as it should have been. I should have realised then no one calls me Anthony.
No.
I should have gone, sorry, mate, I've got the wrong bloke. But I went, do we know each other? And he went, yeah, you killed my best mate from school.
Oh.
And it turned out he'd gone to school with Nicky Payne, one of the guys I'd shot at the abattoir.
Right.
The conversation pretty well finished then. I said something like, you're still in touch with the family? Thinking, don't want the family knowing, what pub I drink in. And he went, no, I haven't seen them in years, and blah, blah, blah. And that was the end of it. But, the hairs on the back of your neck go up a little bit.
Yeah, it does make you think. Well, Tony, I've really enjoyed our conversation today, mate. But before we conclude this interview, first thing is, what does the future look like for Tony Long?
I'm just happy to be with us still, mate.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You get to a certain age and you're happy that you're still pulling your pension. So
exactly,
touch wood. I'm
20 years.
I've not formally retired. There hasn't been a date where I've sort of woken up and gone, right, as of today, I'm not working anymore. But then I'm not looking for work, So I still get little bits come in here and there. And if someone offered me something that I was interested in that would, get me out of the garden and do something more interesting, I would do. But
I might hold you to that, mate.
I'm not looking.
But before we conclude this interview, and it's an old term that you'll remember from your beat days, but is there anything you'd like to add, alter, or correct in relation to the statement that you've made today?
Would you then like me to sign each error at the bottom of
each error? Either you sign it or I'll sign it. It's up to you, mate.
I've got to add a very quick story here.
Go on.
When I was on the SPG, I got nicked for punching a Chelsea football supporter in the mouth. I got not nicked, but I got a complaint for punching a Chelsea football supporter in the mouth when it was all kicking off outside Chelsea in the King's Road. Massive puncher. I got interviewed, and I gave about 20, 30 pages of contemporaneous notes.
Wow.
But, the sergeant's diligently writing it all down and everything else. And then at the end of it, the chief inspector, uniform chief inspector, says to me, he was in charge of complaints, goes, right. He says, I'm telling you now, I don't believe a word of what you said. But now is your opportunity. If there's any questions you want to ask or anything you want to put right, now's the time. So I said, well, I've got a question, actually. He goes, yeah, what's that then? I said, right, I'd like to know what it is that I've said that you disbelieve, and I'd like to know your reasons for disbelieving it, please. And he went, this is my interview. And I said, and I ain't answering your question. So I said to the sergeant, would you mind writing that down? And he says to the sergeant, you don't write that down. So the sergeant's like, oh, do I write it down? Do I write it down? And he said, well, you're going to have to sign it. I said, well, I'm not fucking signing it. He goes, well, you've got to. I said, mate, I'm a police officer. I pull these stunts. I'm not signing that.
No.
So he says, well, I'll go and get the chief superintendent. Because if you remember, you have to get like the unit chief superintendent.
That's right. Yeah.
And put a little thing on it and refuse to sign. So I got left there for ages and ages. And he eventually comes back and he goes, right, you're going to have to sign it. The chief superintendent's not in. I said, all right, I'll sign it. So I initialed each answer and I signed the bottom of each page, but I put stud underneath my initial. And he didn't notice. And then I got to the end of it and I start writing this thing. And I start writing, I initial each error and I've signed the bottom of each page on the clear understanding that, and obviously it's taking too long. And he's going, what are you writing? So I'm now got my hand down. And he's trying to tug it off of me. And I put down, I'm signing it on the clear understanding that I do not accept that this is a full or accurate account of the interview that's taken place, and I'm not prepared for it to be used in evidence. He went absolutely mental. And I was the first person to be interviewed. So I went back to 4-unit SPG and I told the lads what had happened. So when it came their turn to turn up, they all turned up with this Brixton briefcase, the old carry it on your shoulder. So it's probably one of the first official or unofficial tape recorded interviews.
Tape recorded interviews.
And it went dink.
Oh God, Tony, that's hilarious, mate. Look, let's when I get back from my holidays, let's meet up for a beer in town, and I'll buy you a pint somewhere.
Absolutely, look forward to it. Mate.
Listen, God bless. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time.
Nice one. All right, look forward to it.
Take care, Tony.
Take care.
God bless, mate.
Bye,
cheers. Bye bye. Bye bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of X Job Downloaded. Please like, follow, and share. Your support is invaluable. Thank you.